All right. Well, welcome and thank everyone for coming tonight. This is a great crowd. I am extremely excited to introduce Dr. Marianne Muhlebach. Many of you may know her from clinic. She is a pulmonologist at UNC in the CF clinic. Is very interested in research, and so maybe some of your children have participated in some research studies with Dr. Muhlebach. So, no further ado, thank you.
Well, and I would like to thank you, the organizers and Lynn, for getting all of us together here. I know you have these opportunities more often. So I think the meeting this year was particularly exciting, probably. And for me, I also have to say, I was there. My first time at the conference was in 1989. You probably all know that that was a special one when the gene was discovered. And so now I'm like with Pathogenesis, I was like, wow, something really happened. It only, quote unquote, took 30 years, and it's not quite gene therapy, but we're making progress, and we're making good progress. So that was kind of for me also a little bit sentimental. And so the way I'd like to structure the talk is to think through from the pathogenesis airway, kind of what happens in CF, and kind of I'll keep these. No, there's no point there. I'll walk through somehow. Okay. So the underlying problem is really the dysfunction of the CFTR protein, and that leads to increased sodium absorption, inadequate hydration of the airway. And you can see on the image there, this is kind of UNC CF cultures. On the left is the normal one, N. And what's called the PCL, this is the liquid that's around the cilia that clean the mucus. And in CF, what's really striking, look how much smaller that fluid is, because it's all dry and thicker. So that's kind of where because of the sodium absorption, the hydration is abnormal, and that leads to the decreased clearance of the mucus that we are all aware of. And then leads to infection, inflammation, and that kind of then creates that circle between abnormal mucus, more mucus if there's more inflammation if there's more infection, and so forth. So I'll keep kind of going through this concept just to see where are we in therapies and what was discussed. And I obviously won't hit everything, if not, we'll be there in 2 days still. Just some highlights. So I think people have seen those, kind of what the gene on the left really looks like, where it's in the cell membrane and it chaperones the electrolytes and the water back and forth. And what's relevant these days, what people are learning, is the different mutations that exist among there are about 2,000 different gene mutated faulty genes. Only about 200 are really relevant. So the others are either so infrequent or aren't really quite certain what they do. And those have been grouped in different classes that, I'll just use this as a timetable. So the class 5 and 4 are the ones that we call kind of the quote-unquote mild ones, where the pancreas functions normally. And then 1 through 3 are the classic ones, and delta F508 is the class 2. And underneath the percentage is the percent of people who have those mutations. And what's different is what's shown here is where the CFTR protein sits. So in the milder ones, it sits there and it functions partially. This is where it should be. In the class 4, it also is up there, and it functions but a little less. Class 3, it makes it to the cell surface, but it doesn't work at all. So whenever there's kind of a white bar, these electrolytes can get back and forth. Here they have a little bit of problem. Here they have no problem. And then when you look at the other 2 classes, that gene is stuck somewhere inside the cell, so it can't do what it's supposed to be doing. So the challenge was when we developed the modulator therapy, it's much easier to deal with something where at least you've got something that's partially functional, versus something that's in the wrong place and not working. So that's why the early ones, ivacaftor treats those 2, and then they added to the ivacaftor that really just works on this one here. different chemicals that make it come from the middle of the cell up to the cell surface. Like this, so kind of keeping that in mind is what I just said, the ivacaftor for class 4 and 5, and then the lumicaftor, elexacaftor, and, oops, sorry, there is a, yeah, elexacaftor, and ivacaftor, so that's the triple therapy, it's a mouthful, right? And the highlights that I'll go through here on these. Oh, thank you.
Battery's dead on this, but.
Okay, all right, but at least.
This is not a big spoon, right?
I couldn't find the spoon. And so the highlights from the conference, I've kind of structured them, is the trial, wanting to review the trial results that actually came out, were published and released right during the conference, and there were a couple of posters that had kind of made it into it beforehand. Then the longer-term outcomes with these CFTR modulators, and long-term obviously not on Trikafta, because we don't have that data. And then other upcoming ways to treat the CFTR defect, and then alternate strategies for those that don't qualify, that don't have any of those mutations. And so first, the trial results and what just came out. That was the studies called the Efficacy and Safety of elexacaftor, lumicaftor, and ivacaftor. So I'll refer to it as the triple, as most of us do, for those with one mutation of the F508 deletion in their CFTR. So the trial design is a multi-center, multi-nation, double-blind placebo-controlled. So that means that double-blind means neither the patient nor the treatment team knows what the person is on. They get a pill in the morning and a pill in the evening. And either you get the one that's the real one, or you get the one that is a placebo, meaning a kind of a sugar pill is what people usually say. I don't know whether it's sugar or something else. But it looks the same, and you don't know what you or your child is getting. And the first outcome where they looked at the differences were at 4 weeks, and then the whole trial went on for 24 weeks. And typically in these trials, that they were all designed this way, that after the 24 weeks, everybody gets active drug. So it's unblinded, and you can see, on the one hand, you get the benefit of knowing those that were already on the active drug, how are they doing at 48 weeks, right? They have had 48 weeks of treatment. Or the ones who just switch over later, you're like, oh, do they show the same response as the ones who got the active drug right at the start? You have kind of twice as strong too. And obviously for anybody participating, it's a big, hey, I want to be in this study, right? I get something at some point. Yeah. And then all of them went on to 96 open label treatment. So those people who were in those studies are still getting it through the trial, not the insurance. And the inclusion criteria were that they had one mutation of this F508 and then other mutations. I did an asterisk there to remind myself that they had there were certain ones that weren't eligible at all for this if their mutation was too far off. Yeah. And then they had to be older than 12 years. The lung function, so that's abbreviated with FEV1. For all of those that have children that are 6 and over, then you all know what FEV1 is, right? It's this worrisome number that comes back. But those were kind of 40 to 90%, so that's kind of moderate disease. If you take people that are very healthy with 120% lung function, well, you may not see any difference in any benefit because the lungs don't go any further than that. So that's why they chose this medium range. They had to have stable lung disease in the month before, no exacerbations, no flare-ups, and certain exclusion criteria based on known side effects of the drug component. So people who had real liver disease from the cystic fibrosis, they didn't want in there, and also certain infections that are difficult to treat and could confound or confuse the study results. That was the study population. It was very similar for the other trials, so as we'll see on how similar these are all designed. And jumping right into the outcomes. And I think this is one where even I could do the statistics and see there's a difference, right? It's fairly easy. You have on the left-hand side the FEV1, and here is your placebo, so those are not on the drug. And this is just a change. This on the left-hand side, the scale has the 0 to 15. So this is how much they changed from their baseline. So you have the average of everybody at the beginning, and then you look. And what's very surprising, I think, or to me was amazing, is how quickly that went. I mean, the first time they checked at 15 days, it was a huge improvement, and it got a little bit better, and then kind of maintains there. So it's stable. And the placebo group is about the same overall. So that means also at least they didn't have big exacerbations and no changes. What I found very interesting, this is a little unusual but a very helpful slide, is so you're thinking, okay, on the left-hand side, these kind of those arrow bars here. This means, okay, there are all the people and the system and the average of them. And some are above and some are below, but you don't know how many are in which direction. So these bar plots tell you of all the people, how many had no change, how many had some change, and so forth. So the blue is the active treatment, and you see that no change, the 0 is here. So there's a big group that's over here, where most of them had a 10 to 15% improvement. Some amazing ones, right? But more than 30%. And some that there is a few here, and so that's 10 people, so about 5 or so. And those are out of 400 people, I should say. About 5 that didn't get any benefit from it. But I think all very promising looking here, right? I think I've heard a few excited voices already here.
I think we need to clap, like,
All right, so the secondary outcomes, so you always look at many things in a study like this. So they looked at how many flare-ups, pulmonary exacerbations did people have over those 24 weeks. And you see that it was about half in those on the active treatment versus the placebo. So cutting down a lot on those that hospital and IV antibiotics and all of this. And then there is this quality of life. Are people familiar with that? Probably. If you have younger children, less, right? So this is a questionnaire that has been developed specifically for CF, asking, and it goes when you have small children, it's the parents who answer. When it's children 12 and over, they answer themselves. And how do you feel? Have you missed school because of your cystic fibrosis? Do you feel bad? How is your appetite and so forth? And there are different components. One that focuses more on the breathing aspects, and one is more on how do you feel overall? How can you function in life, and other things like that, and activity. And it's adjusted for different ages for children. So that is used both by the FDA for drug approval, but also during studies to see how does it really affect a person with CF in their life to be on this drug. Do you just see a great improvement in your lung function, but still something is really off and you're feeling lousy, or does it make you feel better? So at 4 weeks, you can see how much it improved. A difference, people have looked in this questionnaire, a difference of 4 to 5 points is something that's considered clinically relevant. So 18 is definitely relevant. And it's maintained at 24 weeks and it goes on. But when I looked at those details and I saw minus 2.7, I'm like, how much of this is just disappointment that I'm not getting anything out of this trial? How much is really different? Yeah. Because I think in 24 weeks, you're like, not different. And then, as you all know, we diagnose cystic fibrosis by the salt in your sweat. So if you treat it, if you get this molecule to work and to keep the salt in your in your skin, kind of the sweat glands functioning normally, does that normalize? And so less is, a minus in this regard is a good thing. So minus 42 versus no change in the placebo. which looks at different organ levels that they checked in here. There were obviously also side effects, and people looked for those. I mentioned that people with liver disease weren't included, and this is because, especially with ivacaftor, it was already known that this affects the liver, that you can get elevations in the liver enzymes. And so that was higher, but people with CF, that's why we check liver functions, they fluctuate. So there were some that also with the comparator placebo had some elevations, but 10% isn't that terrible. And they graded it, I didn't put those details in, but they graded it on how many had really high elevation, and that's a really small percentage where you get worried. The other ones is, okay, you go up. After a while, the liver enzymes went down again, so not too worrisome. Interestingly, there were a lot of people who had rash, and that was, I think, probably also unexpected. And then what I found interesting is the rising blood pressure. A little bit, it's not, 3 millimeter, yes, right? When we go to the doctor as we get older, we're like, 3 millimeters, nothing, yeah. But still, it's something to keep in mind. Is that, for me, it's like, is it because they lose less salt and they still eat that much? Is it something that's totally related to the underlying principle of the drug? We will find out more, and we'll also learn as we use the drug, is that anything to worry about or not. The details, the granular details you get in studies. All right, so then switching to the second cohort that was studied, those are the people who had 2 mutations of the F508 del mutation. So that's called Homozygote, because you have 2 parallel on each gene. There is this one. And the trial design, as I said, they are running in parallel, so they're very much the same. Multi-center, multi-nation, kind of, it was Australia, Europe, and US, and Canada. Again, double-blind, placebo-controlled, so you could either end up on the medicine or not. You didn't know, the physicians didn't know, and again, outcomes the same, and also extended to a 96-week open trial. Obviously, the inclusion criteria, they have to have 2 mutations of the F508 deletion. And again, over 12 years, and same, everything essentially the same as before. And so there were 114 people, so fewer people, so they had already some data on the other ones. It did actually, and I can't recall on this or on the other study, I looked on the enrollment. I think on the 400 patients, any guesses how long it took to enroll 400 people?
1 day.
1 week?
4 hours.
Not quite that fast. We need to get people in, we need to consent them and all of this.
Oh, I thought you meant just like, I want to do it.
Oh yeah, that one is probably, yes, that actually went different. That goes like, oh, is this study coming to your center? Can I sign up once it comes? Yeah, there's already that list. But it was 2 months. Wow, I wish we could enroll in other studies that fast. But it shows, I think, the excitement of the CF community and the trust that you all have in us as clinicians and researchers. So the protocol here was easier. The other one was so complicated, the graph, that I decided I'll skip it. But here you have a screening just to make sure everybody is stable before they sign up. And then they had the trial of elexacaftor plus ivacaftor. So there were people with this. Remember that there is a drug out there, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to do what you do if someone is on the double combination. So elexacaftor, ivacaftor, for instance. How do we do them? Do we take them off before and then start them, or do we roll them over? So there is a lot of very smart people who have these trial designs. So what they did is those that were on it, they continued, and then they switched them over later. And then there were those that were naive that you started right away with it. So you could elexacaftor, and then you did this, and then you started that. And the treatment period for those that were naive, you started everything. And then they ran in parallel, and then you kind of get the 28-day extension where everybody is on the same drug. Oh, this was just, yeah, this was how we heard about all these things, and then you looked out in Nashville out of the window. Then you quickly went back to it. That's about what the weather was there. So I also wanted to switch to the, hey, there is a, okay. I missed somehow the data, I apologize, somewhere that was hidden. The results of this were hidden, but I can tell you verbally. So in those people who were before on the Pathogenesis ivacaftor, and in case you're confused with all these names, that's the trade name is blanking. I'm so Cystic, thank you. I'm so trained with talks, I'm not allowed to say the trade names. So anyway, so if you were in Cystic and you switched to the triple, they had about a 10% improvement from that up. So it is a stronger drug. Yeah. All right. So next kind of section, what are the longer term studies? And now we go back to the double combination or ivacaftor by itself. But on these, we have long-term data, which is important because on the triple, the same will be asked eventually, like how does it last, what are the side effects, and all of this. So the ivacaftor, which was, think back to one of the early slides, kind of the ones on the far right-hand side, where the molecule, the CFTR is at the cell surface. The goal study was what it was called, that looked just in long-term follow-up, what did lung function show, was it safe, and all of this. And what it showed is that there was not a drop-off at certain points, but it was continued good lung function and a continued weight gain. And actually I have a graph of that a little later on. On the ivacaftor Pathogenesis, this is in Defect, that one is still ongoing. There's just not enough time yet to show any data, but they just mentioned at the conference, Greg did a nice talk on that yes, we are collecting data. And then there is the other ones is the progress study on ivacaftor-lumacaftor, which is their candy that's been out for longer. And they had, in the initial trial, were 1,100 patients, and 1,000 of them, 92%, were actually signing on for this longer-term study. There is a little incentive to this, yes. And they could stay either on the same dose as they had been in the trial, or they increased one of the components of the drug. And the patients that participated stayed, 82% of them were still on it on 72, and then at week 96, there were suddenly only 42%. And it's like, what happened, right? Well, it got approved by the FDA. So people said, oh, wait a minute, let me get it from my insurance and drop out of the study. And so I'm like, yeah, okay, you can get it. Yeah. And that was, I mean, when you read this, you really go like this. Yeah, but the people who discontinued due to adverse events was 7% in the study. From data from kind of real life CF centers and the registry, it's actually fairly higher than that, the discontinuation rate due to side effects. And I have seen it in patients that I started on it too. Several more of the girls than the boys have trouble with it. But yeah, it's like I'm saying, well, we have something better now. Because remember also with ivacaftor, the improvement in epi-1 was like 5 to 7%. So you get a lot of side effects and relatively little benefit. And then people have used the CF registry, and the patients, each time they come to the visit and they have agreed to it, their data anonymously gets entered into CF registry, and we can use these registry data very well for longer term studies and for comparing cohorts. So what they did there in this progress study, they looked on the one hand on the people they followed, but then said, okay, if we match them to people who are about the same age, same gender, same infections, how does the lung function trajectory compare over time? And you see that those on the ivacaftor-lumacaftor had lower decline in lung function than those who weren't on it. Match them. So the conclusion overall here is also that the longer term studies are definitely very valuable because you learn a lot from them. You can use the registry, but if you have more granular data, more details, it's actually better than just the registry. Okay, so here is what I said, the graph of that study that I just said. So traffic and transport, they all have these fancy names, right? This was the original trials to get Orkambi onto the market. And then they go on into the, and then they go on into this, and you saw that this is kind of when the placebo arm where they switch. And okay, so this is the original placebo. Then they go on drug, like I described initially, right? If you go on drug, and then you can see how this cohort is the red, the green becomes the red. Here they're all on the medication. You see that those that have been on longer, that were blue from the beginning, have very similar running as the other ones. You can see, okay, long term, there's not a big difference. And if you start it later, it's also okay. You attain the same results. Body mass index, so how is your weight to your height, right? You see that they all have a strong weight gain, and it continues to gain. And that's something we will have to pay attention to in the future. Where is the when is good too good? Right? All right. So notable trials that are planned from when the triple comes out. So, or it's come out now, but there was already a lot of planning in multiple levels at the CF Foundation themselves, multiple CF centers, and UNC I know has several planned and will start enrolling. Because as before in the goal, and there was another study where they looked at really detailed outcomes. What is white chloride doing? What is this, and so forth. And in these ones, trials that were just mentioned, the protocols aren't quite finalized or released yet. But one is disease recovery, and then it's extending to other organs. How does the sinuses react? What does sinus disease do? How is the gastrointestinal tract reacting? What about inflammation? And we've seen in other studies, inflammation in the lung seems to be quite difficult to get under control despite everything. And then there is one interesting trial that I'd heard earlier from the people at the CF Foundation. It was fascinating. We all know that people with CF have a tremendous amount of therapies to do all the time, right? I mean, it keeps you busy. So what can we do to make this easier? And let's start first to stop things rather than adding. But it's better to do this in a controlled fashion than have the people try it out themselves. So the way the people went about it is that they sent people out to people. So PWCF is my abbreviation for people with CF. We sent surveys out to people with CF and to providers and evaluated on the one hand, what do you think is the most cumbersome to do, which is the one you would most likely want to get rid of, and on the other hand, which physicians feel is okay to stop given the mechanism of these medications that are coming out. And what came down on both sides is hypertonic saline and DNAs. Inhaled therapies, they take a lot of time. You can do your homework and you can watch TV and video game, all of this, but still it's time consuming. And from the physician and research standpoint is these modulators really get very close to the mucus defect and the mucus hypersecretion. And so it makes sense to stop these things and say, yes, if you still have infection, we can't stop antibiotics. We can stop pancreatic enzymes that quickly. But let's start there. So this is what's planned. I don't know specifics how it will be, but most likely one group will stop one, the other one will stop the other, and the third group stops nothing. And then we look on how it happens, and they will look at lung function, because when hypertonic saline and DNA, so Homozygote, were evaluated initially, the first thing that changes is the lung function. You see that change in about 2 to 4 weeks, relatively quick outreach, so you don't have to wait too long and risk any detriment by being in that study. So that's going to come at some point. So switching topic again a little one. This was a big topic, no one left behind. And how about those people who don't have an F508 deletion, right? Who are in this class 1 and you don't do this. If you want to get a good overview, I'd suggest that once it becomes available, you can look at the plenary one. And it was kind of around the toolbox, what all is there. And Marie Egan explained it in good understandable terms. And I won't go through those details. But on the one hand, there is the gene therapies. Most of the UK Gene Consortium is working on this. And they had several trials with using different vectors. So it's the challenge with gene therapy is how do you get it into your target organ without the body reacting to it, and the gene needs to be multiplying, and that's very hard when you're talking about the lung. So in brief, I said they have some success, but the work's ongoing. So people then use to a different virus to get it into the lungs, using nanoparticles and all kind of, and then the CRISPR-Cas, and then it's the kind of the genetic toolbox when you really you go into your genetic code, you cut something out, and then you stick something else in, and it's kind of right. I see some head shaking. It makes you nervous, right? You know, like you're really getting down this. So I'll keep it on this overview that there's plenty going on, and I'm not a molecular geneticist myself, so too complicated. So the other aspect is what other companies and drugs are in the pipeline here. This is kind of from the CF website, the pipeline. I'm just looking at those that restore CFTR function, and so preclinical speaks for itself. It's the far left. Then you have phase 1. And then phase 2 is when it is going to people where they first look at, not phase 1 is more, is it safe? What would be a good dose? And phase 2 is, all right, is it safe, a good dose? And does it do something? And if it does something in a small cohort, then you go to those big trials of 100 to 400 people. So there is one from VX, stands for Vertex. Then there is FV, has 2 compounds. Then there is Flatley Labs, and then there is PPI, who has a fairly good, and I've got more data on them. And then there is, I don't know actually who MRT stands for, but there are several other ones, and proteostasis is the PPI, yes. And they do the same approach where they say, okay, we use one drug, we add another one, we add a third one, and then we look. And when they wrote the abstract, the triple hadn't come out yet, and those results weren't known. So it's a little bit, it sounds like a race there on who's getting it. And right, and here will be the challenges. You know, you have all these companies who are also investing, who are working hard to bring something out to the market that people may tolerate better. Some people who didn't have much of an effect with the triple may be doing better on some other compound. How can you study this, right? Because you have so many people will be on a triple and don't want to stop them taking it. But you need participants, so it creates a very interesting phenomenon. And so, again, those biostatisticians who are very knowledgeable, and Nicole, my handler, she's one of them, kind of think about these things. How do we design this? And the ideas are how to understand additive effects of symptom-based therapy. So, as I said, the DNase hypertonic scaling. Then do you stop the existing modulator therapy for a patient to taste a different medication, or do comparative trials? You do them head on. Well, I think most of you know the cost of these medications. So it would either have the pharma company who says, we provide this medication to test it against our competitor, who also agrees to test it, to provide it free, or no one can afford to run a study like this. 100 patients, 300,000 a year, you can't run this study, and then times 2. So it's going to be challenging times in these regards. And I imagine, given the current discussions and how far the CF Foundation and everybody has gotten, they'll find a way. I think there is a way out to discuss it and just call it on industry and say, you've got to make this happen. You've got to help here. Yeah. And then the other question is, and you all will think about that more and know it more, will there be enough people with CF who are still willing to participate? And an interesting one is also there will be more heterogeneity between people with CF because some are eligible and can get on those triple therapies or whatever is available then. Some will be younger when they started, some will be older. If you're older, you may have already had a lower lung function and you recover this. And then if you have the wrong insurance who doesn't pay for it, you might be eligible, but you still can't afford it. And that's even bigger in other countries than in the US. So this was Chris de Boek. She is a Belgian physician and researcher. She was head of the European CF Foundation for many years, and she just stepped down and retired. But she was at the meeting and spoke, right? And so she addressed the aspect of what's the cost of such medications and how will that result in inequalities. So I should kind of, as a preamble, in the US, the FDA approval equals access to care as long as the insurance that you have pays for it. In Europe, Canada, and Australia, there is a medical risk benefit that is on the one hand, so it's the European Medical Agency that approves it, that's the FDA of Europe, but then that doesn't mean it's allowed to be marketed. Then there is a different group that sits together and said, what's the cost-benefit ratio? And it's a really tough decision, right? And so many countries in Europe just got Orkambi approved to be allowed to prescribe to people. And so elexacaftor-lumacaftor hasn't, or elexacaftor, so Symdeko hasn't even been discussed yet, and now there comes a triple. And so they might only get access to this in a year or two. It'll go much faster than the other ones because the benefit is so much higher. But it's an interesting phenomenon that you say, gosh, you have these differences based on all the regulatory aspects of things. It really kind of made me swallow twice when I thought through it. Probably also my European background. So the other aspect, I think, is genetic background. So the Hispanic or Latinx communities. They had several talks of this, and they, depending on where they came from in South America or Spain or wherever, they have different mutations, and they can have mutations that are not eligible for any of the current modulators. So it's kind of this smaller subgroup now. And interestingly, one of the, okay, I didn't write it down yet, but one of the presentations was on how genetic background differs between the western part of the US and the eastern part of the US among the Hispanic or Latinx communities. And so they actually saw that people in California, a lot of people with Hispanic background have mutations that are harder to treat and are generally have worse outcomes than people, for instance, in New York, South Carolina, North Carolina. So it's, I'm like, okay, we're learning as we go. And then, of course, there's a language barrier too. So I think all of this, we have to keep thinking, yeah, and make sure we are all inclusive. Yeah, okay. So getting to the next topic here, mucus and infection. At UNC, we have lots of mucus-based studies going on. No, not studies, yeah, I mean, it's these kind of, what is mucus, what is it composed of, and how does it flow, and how does it not flow, and so forth. Tons of people who can talk hours about fevers, right? And so this is the next area I wanted to address. So infection, which is kind of my background and interest in studies, is one, just to highlight, is we all know that there is a variety of bacteria in a given lung, and now people are getting more aware of the fungi or molds that are there. And so the presentations that were there was, how do we detect them? and that people are developing quick methods for detecting them, where you can kind of probe for the 43 bacteria and molds in one sample. Then what the question arises, so how relevant are they? I think you've all heard from your physician on like, oh, we've detected this bacteria and we're not sure what it does. Then we'll add the fungus to it and say, well, we've detected it, we're even less certain what it does. As penicillin involves, which is a mold that kills the bacterium around it, right? So do other molds do the same thing. So Aspergillus is, for instance, there was one presentation that looked at Aspergillus and Pseudomonas, how they kind of fight against each other, help and to combat each other at the same time. And then the third angle that was discussed in that presentation is from an Irish speaker on how relevant is it when they use at the registry. And they found that people who had both Pseudomonas and a fungal infection generally had worse outcomes. So their thought is maybe we should be treating it. Obviously, treatment is not that easy for fungus especially, and a lot of the medications we use are the ones that are not compatible with the CFTR modulators. So that's question there. It's interesting. And then here's my one slide on MRSA, and I do a lot of studies on it, so I already one slide on staff. So bacteria in general, we in Pseudomonas, we've kind of learned if you treat it early, you can get rid of it. I've done a couple of done one, and I'm in the process of another one to think about if children or adults develop infection with methicillin-resistant staph, so the MRSA, should we treat it very early? And maybe that is an answer, because what we are also learning is that staph has also mechanism to adapt to the lungs and its environment and to escape the antibiotics. So there is not only mucoid Pseudomonas, we're also learning that there are mucoid MRSA. This is one of our culture plate from the lab. And then this is, so Luke Hoffman, Brigitte Koll, and myself, we're all kind of keep competing and collaborating. It's quite interesting when we all talk to each other and exchange ideas and then write grants against each other. So this is from her presentation. This is what the staph grows like on a plate normally, and then there is what we call the small colony variants, where they are what they're named for, right? They're just smaller. And what I'm working with one of our basic microbiologists at UNC is he has something he calls some persistent phenotypes, which is yet another slightly different ones, and we're trying to figure out what happens then. And it is so bacteria live and breathe and feed and so forth. So what they do is they hibernate. So there's lots of antibiotics, lots of hosts that attacks where the neutrophils and all these cells try to kill the antibiotics. And what the bacteria have learned to do is they just go in hibernation. They said, I'm not there, I'm not multiplying, so you can't kill me. And as soon as that pressure of the antibiotics is gone, they start multiplying again. So that's our research there, and we'll have to figure out then the next step is what can you do about it. And here is one novel that you may hear in the news, and it sounds really, really exciting, and we just have to see whether it holds up to it. Bacteriophages are little viruses that infect bacteria, and they make them feel as bad as a virus makes us feel. So they feel lousy, and they multiply within the bacterium. So this is what it looks under the electron microscope, and this is a cartoon on how they attach to the bacterium. Then they go into the bacterium, and as they multiply inside those bacterial cells, they lyse them to burst out the bacteria. So it's got good and bad sides of it. It sounds very, very exciting, right? You're combating one organism with the other, because they self-replicate. So you're like, okay, as long as this bacterium is there, they divide, but they're very specific. It's not just you want a Pseudomonas aeruginosa. No, you want a Pseudomonas aeruginosa that has this and that receptor on its surface. So they just really got like a little niche that they can bind to. And once that niche is gone, they disappear, so to speak, or they find another niche. So that's the part that we all have to learn before we get too excited about it. The dosing is quite unknown. So far, in all the case reports that people have done. They just redose until the patient gets better. Resistance develops quite quickly, and the idea is to combine it with antibiotics and say, okay, there are certain receptors. When bacteria become resistant, they develop changes on their surface that is detectable by certain bacteriophages. You can train your bacteriophage, or you can design it to detect these antibiotic resistance, and then you say, okay, the phage takes care of those resistant bacteria, and my antibiotics take care of the other ones. So it's an elegant design, and there are the risk that people also is one side effect is you have to design it for each person individually. So it's not like you prescribe it and you go take it off the shelf. And what is people who are really into the field, they say, well, it's only case studies. We don't know if this phage can mutate and then it attacks something else, it attacks your gut bacteria or something. I mean, it can get off target potentially. That's unknown. There were some, and interestingly, all was developed in the 1940s, before the antibiotics became big time news. And then people found out that it's not quite as easy, the preparations weren't that clean, and there were side effects. And it's still in Russia, it's actually still used, and some people go there to get their phage therapy. So it's interesting to travel there for the idea. Okay, so getting to the complex spectrum of other factors, as I summed it up, is one, gastroenterology. So you know this little wimpy-looking little child here. And in 2009, half of the infants have a weight for length below the 5th percentile at the time of diagnosis. So 2009 was pre-universal newborn screening. So now we pick them up a lot earlier. So most of them are now fairly good. And it's hard for the babies to catch up if they are behind in their growth. And if you grow faster, your lungs grow faster because your body is smaller, right? So a study is the first study that started in 2012, and they followed they kind of sampled all the newly diagnosed infants. And currently they have 183 infants. And they kind of really literally took all the feeding, all the details. And the early results showed that children who were exclusively breastfed had a lower weight and slower weight gain at age 4 to 6 months. They also had lower levels of certain essential fatty acids. And the ones there, are the ones that people looked for, because we know that in adults with CF, those essential fatty acids can be lower. They don't absorb them as well, but mostly they get used up in their inflammation. That's why those essential fatty acids are lower. And so they then said, okay, well, if we fortify the breast milk or the formula, you actually can raise those levels up. And another aspect, they looked in the children who have poor growth, that don't want to eat, the picky eaters and so forth, that appetite stimulants, when used, they were generally effective. And we all know what the toddler does anyway, right? With or without CF, they're difficult eaters. So that's kind of their goal, is to have them all look like this. And so related back to the CFTR modulators. So the effects occur in the pancreas, the liver, bile acids, gut bacteria, kind of all of those organs are affected. And in the pancreas, people with CF who are pancreatic sufficient, so the ones that are kind of on the milder, what we call the milder spectrum, but they are at risk for developing pancreatitis, which is an inflammation of the pancreas. Symptoms are you have really, really abdominal pain, you vomit, can't take any food for then you come to the hospital typically and need IV fluids and all of this until it heals. So it's a very painful condition, and people with pancreatic sufficiency can have this over and over again. And one study followed such people when they started ivacaftor and kind of said, well, if we make this pancreas potentially even more functional, will they have more problems with pancreatitis? And they did not see that. If anything, and it's small numbers, they said it might be even decreasing, so that's good news. The other question is, could people who are now pancreatic insufficient, and you make that pancreas just a little bit work, could that lead to pancreatitis? And there are a few case reports, and those are data that are being followed in all these specialized studies to make sure that this doesn't happen too frequently. And also to know, how should enzymes be dosed? Do we need to make a change? And next organ, stomach and duodenum, threw those together. So as you know, people with CF have a lot of stomach acid, and it's not neutralized normally in the duodenum, which can affect the absorption of the enzymes. And so this group, Gelford, they looked at the pH profile. So there are little capsules that you can swallow and that travel through your GI tract and measure the pH all the ways. And then when it comes out at the other end and you hopefully catch it, then you can download the data essentially. So all these amazing things, right, you can do. And so they said that it does improve the pH profile. Liver and gut to the next slide here. So the new findings related to the modulators on the liver. We know on the one hand it can increase the transaminases. On the other hand, it improves the circulation of the bile acids. We know that people with CF, that's why why transaminases can go up. Transaminases are kind of markers of liver damage in a way, but it's reversible. And that is because the bile, another fluid that has to be secreted, doesn't go through the liver that well. And then with the CFTR modulators, they actually saw that they get through the liver and into the gut a lot better. And bile acids are not just what we think of as digesting fat when we have a good meal like this one, right? They're also there, they get recirculated, and they help the gut bacteria work and metabolize our food and be healthy gut bacteria. So this is why people then look, okay, and how does this affect the gut bacteria? And so they, in this study here by Lee, I think is how I should say his name, they had 16 patients, and you see that not all of them contributed to samples before and after starting ivacaftor, but they looked at 3 groups of gut bacteria, and generally it seems like they go up in some people more than in others, and these enterobacteriaceae, which you don't really want to have, they did come down. So why is that relevant? Well, nicely, the next person who spoke picked up on this too, Michael Surratt, who is a microbiologist from Canada. And he says, as you all know, abdominal pain is a very frequent symptom about people with CF. And there are multiple reasons. It doesn't go through the gut as quickly because of the pH changes. You get constipation, bacterial overgrowth, if you have the wrong bacteria growing in the wrong spot. So he took this study and said, you know, it's important that this group here, the Akkermansia, is actually metabolizing mucins. So that is, mucins are normal in CF, so that's probably why they are thriving, because they get the better mucins now. But the other interesting thing that was new to me too, that gut bacteria we're all learning are really, really relevant to our overall health. And there are certain ones that can produce metabolites that either enhance or decrease your sensitivity to pain. So if you have the wrong gut bacteria, not only do you have more bloating and this, you're also more sensitive to the sensation, which then of course makes you feel even more miserable. But this is a kind of also an ongoing direction to look at. All right, and here is I showed the slide on how the BMI keeps going up. There are ongoing weight gain, and that's a multitude. The same reasons that lead the children to need so much more calories is the same that now they need less calories. So here is from the registry. So Patrick Bloom used registry data and looked over the years. Here's 2019 from 1995. The kind of these medium blue circles are the children that are underweight, or people with CF that are underweight. So that goes constantly down. Then the dark ones are the ones that are overweight, keeps constantly going up. And then there is the yellow ones that are the ones that are going obese. So now we have people at the same same number that are underweight than there are obese. And I was very surprised, and that's before triple therapies and before it can't be all the people who are on ivacaftor. So I think it shows generally that there is such a better outcome and less loss of lung function, better therapies in many aspects that people are gaining weight. And I know for those of you who have small children, you're like, it'll never happen, right? They just don't eat, they just don't put on weight. But I mean, I've also had some 7, 8-year-olds that I had to counsel the parents. I said, we need to do something about this weight gain. So it's a good and a bad, right? I took it home also as a thought, like we need to think on what recommendations we give you as parents and people with CF on what you should be eating, and not say, oh, hamburger and fat and all this McDonald's diet is good. Just keep thinking long term, what is healthy for you, the avocados, the olive oils, and all of those things if we do want to enhance calories, but not necessarily just butter and lard for everything. So it's healthy diets. I'm an exercise freak, so I put that there in between, and keep thinking about those things as they live longer. All right, and that was the one we heard at the beginning. The other thing I had is 1989, when I was at the first meeting of CF. I was working in Switzerland then, and I come there and meet someone I knew from high school. And she was there, and I'm like, wait a minute. And we were in high school together. And she's like, hey, you know I have CF. And I'm like, yeah, I darkly remember this. It was kind of as a kid, I didn't think about it. So then I told her, I said, well, I've got a hotel right here downtown. Why don't you stay with me? So we stayed together, and I was jet lagged. And she gets up at 6 in the morning, starts her therapies, and I'm lying there and thinking, wow, you can do it. And by the way, I just called her last week because it's her birthday. So still, yeah. And she has, yeah, exactly. She's doing before any. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So she's doing well, and she's still doing her therapies and everything. So that's why for me also those 30 years were exciting. All right. Thank you. Oh, wait a minute. Actually, here is the one to finish off on. Just something really even completely different. Yeah. All right. Was there any questions? Absolutely.
I just have, well, I have a couple questions, but anyway, how much weight gain is seen so far with the triple? I mean, 10%, 15%?
So it's probably exactly. Percent is difficult because you have people from 12 years that are still growing too. But it's yeah. It's been, what is it, in the 5% range or so. I mean, it's they gain weight very quickly too. So as their lungs kind of improve and their probably absorption improves. We have had people on other therapies with mostly ivacaftor that really had to come off and could come off their enzymes. And we don't know with the triples, and depending on your stage of disease, how much of the pancreas function is really, really lost versus like the liver. The enzymes and the secretions are stuck in the pancreas, but the pancreas itself is still to some degree functional. That's, yeah. There will be one of the many kind of follow-up trials will look specifically at all the GI aspects of what happens with CFTR modulators with the triples.
Does that go with the CFRD as well? Like with that?
Yes, exactly. I'm not exactly. I apologize. I skipped all the endocrinology because I didn't have time to go to those things anyway. Yeah. But that's exactly it. And we also know, and maybe you have seen that too, that the CF diabetes can fluctuate a little bit, right? There are times when you need hardly any insulin or no insulin, And then there is a stress phase at school, at college, whatever, and suddenly insulin is needed again, right? So that tells you the insulin isn't gone completely. I mean, the insulin part function of the pancreas is still functional, and that could very well help. Yes. So I think if anybody with CF diabetes who starts on triples should monitor carefully their sugars. Another one.
Yeah, so how long do you think it'll take to see the stages? I mean, you said they're a long way off, or like best case on, FDA.
So FDA approved, that's the challenge of it, because every patient would need their own FDA approval. Because each one has their own therapy, and FDA itself is not quite sure on how to do this. So you grant one to everybody, to kind of one company who does it. It's somewhere between university and companies who are developing this, meaning a university and then someone spins off their own company from the university research. And some of them are advocating a kind of a cocktail of phages, where you're like, okay, one does this, one does this. Yeah. And that to me sounds like the same, I would call it mistake that we did with antibiotics, right? If we treat everything in one antibiotic, the broadest spectrum, well, then you also risk the highest resistance. So I think that's kind of the enthusiasm, and there is always, especially with anti-infectives, for companies who have to make a profit or have to at least pay for it itself. If you make it to a very small population, you can't make a benefit. The more people use it, the better it is. But then the bacteria develop a mechanism to escape it. I think it's more that, and I think right now, I also had had lunch with a microbiologist who chaired that session about the phages. He put it together, and he said. The people who really understand about this, he said, it's two camps. The ones who totally fear it and the ones who absolutely love it. Mm-hmm. And we'll have to see where it all comes together. Yeah. But it tells you it's not quite as fantastic as it sounds at first go.
And one more question for me, I'm sorry, that's it. So you have Kalydeco, right, and whatever that is, 7%. And then you may have said this and I might have missed it. So will they go on the triple?
That depends individually on how people do on the Kalydeco. If they are expected to have any further gain from the triple, and how people feel about it. There may be that. I mean, it's like, do I buy a new computer because it's the newest model out, or do I continue to use the one that I have that I know has worked out all the kinks? Right, there's that aspect of it too, and we actually, I think, discussed it in our group lately, and said, well, exactly. Some people may prefer to say, I don't want the newest model. I want the one where we know the side effects, we know it's safe, and it's something with a little bit more experience. The online people can ask questions.
One of them dropped off.
I saw that one dropped off somewhere. I have to get the
Tatiana's still there.
Okay.
She says great. Yep. You can ask her.
They had this actually at the meeting itself that you would sign into that session, and then you could ask your questions online, and the moderators would then get it on their app, and very nicely actually it listed it. I'm sure a computer algorithm kind of comprised and said, okay, those are questions similar, and then it would come up 3 questions. Wanted to know this one. So as a moderator, you quickly say, oh, here's an important question because we have 7 people wondering about this.
Yeah, it was amazing. Really cool. It was. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Another survey? I feel so important.
I haven't been surveyed this much ever. You take one and pass it around.
Are you gonna
mention that you did a workshop? I wasn't planning to. No, it was the poster presentation. Lynn did it. We did it together. So, no, I wasn't gonna. Yes.
Okay, I'll leave you those.
Thank you. Here. I wasn't planning to.
probably,
Well, that's why we're doing the surveys, because the feedback I got. So we need to like show some data.
Stay standing up, folks, because now I'm not really saying anything.
Make your video as long as you can.
Today is all
One time you need something.
Really? Yeah, he mapped the CFTR gene.
kids, some are adults.
Yeah, and it was really funny. Our older daughter, so she just started Trikafta today, but she went to the clinic to go for her appointment, and her friend from college had offered for her to use her car, and she really wants to go with Teresa, with our daughter, because wants to go into medicine. But anyway, Teresa couldn't go, but this girl told her if she had gone to work out, she sat in a sauna that morning. She doesn't work out on campus because she doesn't want to be shamed by the college students, so she goes off campus. So she was like in the sauna with this guy, and he said he mapped it, but she said she was telling him that she'd let Teresa, whatever, and he said, oh, I mapped the CFTR gene, so we don't know who it was because there were 3 of them. So there's one of them actually was one of 2. So anyway, it was just so random.
Our whole thing is he going to be responsible? So it's not like yeah, even though he's been fantastic, he's never.
They have the watch.
Yeah, like you hear, definitely. And I can see pressure here.
Oh, he has been
He was in.
Yes.
You guys are doing well?
Yeah, that's my daughter. She's both med tech, junior, one's a freshman.
I know.
But yeah, she's also pretty concerned about policy, so she's right yeah. So, but yeah, they just started they just got it approved. So everyone's probably been able to get it earlier since she started last week. And Grace is the only one who started
You're gonna see improvement soon.
Yeah. Yeah, the young one, she said she didn't feel like stuff kind of was breaking up or whatever, it just was clear. So, yeah, it's like a
Yeah, we thought we were on track. So we were convinced and then literally, you went on that, we went out. In the low 90s.
That is startling about that virus that aliens like.
Would love to see him. I think our biggest.
Right.
They also like. But he burns a lot.
Yeah. He's out to
I wanted to.
No, and it's been, we are,